Welcome to Cozy English. Tonight we are going somewhere. Travel is one of the few things in life that is almost never exactly what you expected, and almost always worth it anyway. You plan the trip and then you take it, and the thing that happens is something else, something adjacent to the plan, or orthogonal to it, or entirely off the map. A delay that becomes the best afternoon of the journey, a wrong turn that leads somewhere the guidebook didn't know about, a person met in a corridor or on a train or in the rain, who you talked to for 2 hours and whose name you can't remember, and who said something that stayed. Tonight's stories are about all of that, about going, and about what going does to you, what it shows you, what you carry home that you didn't pack. As you listen, let your body settle. Let your breathing slow. You are resting and learning at the same time, which is exactly what this channel is for. The English is moving through you even now. Let it. Before we begin, if you haven't subscribed to this channel, please do. We make these stories for English learners all over the world, and every subscriber helps us keep going. Share us with a friend who is learning. Leave a comment in the morning if something stays with you from tonight. Now, let's go. Story 1. The Wrong Train. She took the wrong train on the second day, which turned out to be the best decision of the trip. She had meant to go north, to the coastal town she had planned, the one in the guidebook with the harbor and the fish restaurant recommended by 3 different sources. She had looked at the board, made a decision, boarded, and was 20 minutes into the journey before she looked at her ticket and understood what she had done. The train was going south. She considered getting off at the next station and going back. She considered this for about 4 minutes, and then decided, on no very solid basis other than a feeling, not to. She stayed on. She watched the landscape change, the flatness giving way to something more varied, hills appearing on the left, a river appearing and disappearing alongside the tracks. She got off at a town she had never heard of because the name, on the station sign, looked interesting. The town was small. It had a market square and a church and several cafes and a quality of Friday afternoon that was specific and good. The relaxed quality of a place where people were finishing the week rather than passing through it. She sat in a cafe and drank coffee and ate something she couldn't identify from the menu, but that was very good. And she watched the square, and she realized, in the pleasant state of having nowhere she was supposed to be. She spent the afternoon in the town. She found a bookshop, very small, run by a man who spoke some English and who recommended a local history of the region that she bought and read over the following evenings, and that gave her a picture of the place she was traveling through that the guidebook had not. She ate dinner at a restaurant on the square. She took the evening train to the nearest city and found a hotel. The coastal town with the harbor never happened. She didn't miss it. What she had instead was a Friday afternoon in an unnamed town, and the particular pleasure of time that belonged entirely to her, unscheduled, unplanned, arrived at by accident. She told this story for years. The lesson she drew from it changed over time. At first it was about flexibility. Later it was about the value of getting things wrong. Later still she thought it was about something else. The way the best parts of travel were often the parts that hadn't been organized. The parts where you stopped managing and simply arrived somewhere and saw what was there. Story 2. 6 weeks alone. When Marcus decided to travel alone for 6 weeks, the people who knew him well were surprised, and the people who knew him less well were more surprised. He was not, by nature, a solo person. He was the one who organized things, who made group trips happen, who was most comfortable when surrounded by people he knew. The decision to travel alone had come from a specific and honest self-assessment. He had never done it, and he was 41, and the things he had never done were beginning to have a particular weight to them. He chose a country he had always wanted to visit and booked 6 weeks and told very few people in advance, partly to preserve the decision from the gentle erosion of other people's doubt. The first week was difficult in a way he had not anticipated. Not dangerous or lonely in any acute sense, just uncomfortable in the specific way of a person who is used to managing situations and who finds himself in situations he cannot manage, only navigate. He did not speak the language. He made mistakes that had no one else to absorb them. He ate dinner alone in restaurants and was very aware of eating dinner alone in restaurants, which is the particular awareness of someone who is not used to it. By the second week, something had shifted. He had begun to understand that the discomfort of the first week was not the problem to be solved, but the thing to be got through. That on the other side of it was a different quality of experience, one that required the discomfort as a precondition. He was more present than he was used to being. He noticed more. He talked to people he would not have talked to in a group, because in a group there was always someone to talk to. Alone, he reached further. He met, in the 5th week, a woman from a different country who was also traveling alone, and who had been doing it, she told him, on and off for 20 years. He asked her if she ever got used to eating dinner alone in restaurants. She thought about it seriously. No, she said, but I stopped minding. He went home after 6 weeks different, in a way he found hard to describe. Not more adventurous exactly. He did not become a solo traveler in any regular sense, but more comfortable with his own company, more aware of what he was capable of without a safety net, and, perhaps most importantly, less afraid of the discomfort that preceded the good things, less likely to back away from the things that felt too uncertain. The 6 weeks had cost him time and money, and a great deal of awkward evenings. He thought it had been, straightforwardly, worth it. Story 3. The Overnight Train. The overnight train from one city to another was 12 hours, and Priya had bought a couchette, which was a small folding bed in a compartment she shared with 5 strangers. She had been slightly nervous about this before boarding. She had imagined difficulty sleeping, or an uncomfortable atmosphere, or the particular vulnerability of sleeping in a small space with people you did not know. What she found, when she got into the compartment, was a group of people who were all doing the same slightly awkward social negotiation of strangers who were going to spend the night in close quarters, and who were all, as a result, unusually polite and quiet and considerate. The compartment contained a young man who fell asleep almost immediately and did not stir until morning. 2 women traveling together who spoke quietly and were asleep by 10. An older man with a book who read until quite late and who, when she couldn't sleep and sat up, nodded at her with the companionable acknowledgement of a fellow nightwaker and herself. She watched the dark countryside from the window for a while. There was not much to see. Fields, occasionally a lit road, once a town that went past in a ribbon of orange light and then was gone. She found the dark and the movement and the particular sound of a train at night, the rhythm of it, the way it occupied a frequency that was not quite noise and not quite silence, more soothing than she had expected. She slept in 3 separate pieces, which was not restful in the usual sense, but produced, in the spaces between, a kind of half-waking that was specific to this kind of travel, the awareness that you were moving, that you were being carried, that you did not need to do anything. She found this unusually restful. She arrived at the morning city in the early light. stiff and slightly bleary, and walked out of the station into a place she had never been, and the particular quality of a city at 7 in the morning, the emptiness, the possibility, the sense of a place before it was fully itself, was something she thought she could only have had by arriving this way, in the dark and then the light, by train. She made a note to take more overnight trains. Story 4. Getting lost. Tom had always had a poor sense of direction. This was a fact he had lived with and organized around. Careful with maps, early to check routes, reluctant to deviate from the established way. In the city he had gone to visit, he had a map and a plan. Then it rained, and his phone lost battery, and the map became difficult to read in the wet, and he had made a decision at a crossroads that had, over the following 40 minutes, taken him some distance from where he had intended to be. He stood on a street he didn't recognize and took stock. The street was residential. It was quiet, with the quiet of a neighborhood in the middle of the day. There were trees and some bicycles and a small square at the end that he could see from where he was standing. He was not in any danger. He was lost, which was an inconvenience, and he began to realize as the rain eased slightly, not much more than that. He had been planning to visit a museum that afternoon. He was no longer near the museum. He walked toward the small square instead. The square had a fountain and some benches and a church that was open. He went into the church because it was dry. The church was dark and quiet and very old, and it had a quality that churches of a certain age had, the accumulated quiet of a great many years of quiet. And he sat in a pew for a while and did nothing. He had been moving fast for 4 days. He had covered a great deal of ground and visited a great deal of things and taken a great deal of photographs. He had been experiencing the city at a pace that felt productive and that, had he now understood, made the experience somewhat thin. He had been collecting places rather than being in them. He sat in the church for 40 minutes. He looked at the ceiling. He thought about the museum he was not going to. He felt, very gradually, something that he could only call stillness. Not boredom, not emptiness, but a quality of actual rest. He found his way back eventually, with help from a woman in a shop who drew him a small map on the back of a receipt. He visited the museum the following day, which was a Friday, which meant it was quieter. What he kept from the afternoon was not the church, specifically, or the small square. It was the understanding that getting lost had given him what the plan had not left room for: the unstructured afternoon, the stillness, the pew and the ceiling and the 40 minutes of nothing. He had been planning his way around the possibility of this kind of time, and what he needed, it turned out, was exactly this kind of time. Story 5. The Guest House. The guest house was not in the guidebook, which was how she found it, by following a hand-drawn map given to her by a woman in a market who had said, when asked for a recommendation, "Not the hotel, no, this place." The guest house was at the end of an alley, behind a door that did not look like the door of anything in particular. She knocked. The woman who opened it was in her 60s and expressed neither surprise nor excessive welcome, just the calm acknowledgement of someone expecting guests, which Clara was, apparently, despite not having booked. She was shown to a room. The room was small and had a window that looked onto a garden, a real garden, with plants she couldn't name, and a cat that appeared on the wall at irregular intervals and surveyed things. The bed had the quality of a bed that had been made carefully. The towels were old but clean. At breakfast, eaten in a room downstairs with 3 other guests, also strangers, the host brought things she had not ordered: bread and something in a jar. and eggs, and tea in a pot. She ate more than she usually ate at breakfast. The other guests were a couple from one country and a man traveling alone from another, and they had the breakfast conversation of strangers at a guest house, light, curious, requiring nothing. She stayed 3 nights when she had planned to stay 1. What she thought about traveling home was the woman who had opened the door and the room with the garden and the cat on the wall and the breakfasts she had not ordered. She thought about the difference between a place where she was processed, checked in, given a key, given a number for checkout, and a place where she was, in some harder-to-name way, received. The guest house had received her. She had not expected to care about this distinction until she felt it. She recommended the guest house to everyone who was going to that city for the next 3 years. None of them could find it. The alley and the door and the hand-drawn map had belonged to a particular afternoon in a particular market, and whatever combination had produced the guest house for her had not reproduced itself for them. Some things, she thought, were yours specifically, not because they were better, but because you arrived at them in the right moment, in the right way. Story 6. First Time Abroad. The first time Yusuf left his country was at 19, on a student exchange program to a city in Northern Europe. He had applied on impulse and been accepted without fully believing he would be, and had spent the weeks before departure in a state that oscillated between excitement and a very specific terror that he could not entirely name. He had not been on a plane before. He had not been anywhere alone before. He had not been anywhere that was not home. The plane was fine. The landing was fine. The airport was larger than any building he had ever been in, and he spent 20 minutes finding the right exit, which was mildly stressful and entirely survivable. The family he stayed with were kind people who had hosted students before and who had developed from this a practiced ease with people who did not speak the language well and who needed more time in every exchange. The mother spoke slowly and clearly and never made him feel that the slowness was condescension, only consideration. The father was quieter but showed him things, where the bus stop was, how to use the local app for transport, the best route to the university. The city was cold in a way that was different from any cold he had known. He wore more layers than he had brought, and bought more at a market in the second week. He walked everywhere because the walking was the way he learned the city, and the city revealed itself to him gradually, the way cities do when you are in them rather than passing through. There was a week in the 5th month when he was lonely in a way that felt absolute. He had made friends, real ones, people he liked, but there was a layer beneath the friends, beneath the language he was improving in, beneath the competence he was accumulating, where he missed home with a specificity that surprised him. He missed the particular smell of his mother's cooking and the sound of his own language in the street, and the texture of the ordinary day he had always had. He had not known, until it was gone, how much of his sense of himself was held in those things. He called home more that week. He did not tell his parents how he felt, because he did not want them to worry, and because he knew, with a certainty he was not sure how he had acquired, that the week was a week and not a permanent state. He was right. It passed. He came home 6 months after he left. The homecoming was strange in its own way. The familiar things slightly unfamiliar. The streets the same streets and yet walked by someone slightly different. He had left and returned. He was the person who had done that, now, and doing it had changed the dimensions of what he thought was possible. Story 7. The Mountain. She had not planned to climb the mountain. The mountain was simply there, visible from the town where she was staying, and after 4 days of looking at it, she had gone to the tourist office and asked about the path, and the woman at the desk had given her a map and said, "It's 6 hours up and 4 hours down. Start early." She started at 6 in the morning. The first hour was through forest, on a path that was clear and well-trodden. The second hour became steeper. By the third hour, she was above the tree line and the mountain showed itself in its full scale, and she stopped and looked at it for a while and thought, "I am going up that." There were other people on the path. Not many, but some. A couple who moved faster and overtook her in the third hour. A group of 4 who were slower and whom she overtook later. She exchanged the mountain greeting, which was the same in every language, a nod, sometimes a word, the acknowledgement that you were both doing this thing. The last hour to the summit was the hardest. The path became loose rock and required attention. She was tired in the specific way of a body that has been asked to do something sustained and unfamiliar, and the tiredness had a quality she associated with being very present. She was not thinking about anything except the rock and her foot placement and the breath that she was managing. At the summit, a cross and a tin box containing a guest book and a view in every direction that she stood in for a long time without speaking, because there was no one to speak to, and also because speech felt like the wrong tool for what she was looking at. She signed the guest book. She ate the food she had brought, which was simple and was very good because she had earned it. She began the descent. Going down was harder than she had expected. Her knees, the different set of muscles required, the concentration needed on loose ground. It was also, in a way she had not anticipated, more beautiful than going up, because she was now facing outward, facing the valley and the distance, rather than facing the mountain itself. She reached the town at 4 in the afternoon and sat outside a cafe and ordered a large meal and ate it very slowly and felt, in her whole body, something that was tiredness and satisfaction so thoroughly mixed they were indistinguishable. She had not planned to climb the mountain. She had climbed the mountain. This was the thing about travel, she thought, or one of the things. The plan was the scaffold. What got built on it was something else. Story 8. The language. He had studied the language for 8 months before the trip, which was not enough to be fluent and was more than enough to be dangerous. Enough that he trusted himself in situations where he should not have. He had studied from a book and 2 apps and a set of recordings he listened to on his morning walks, and what he had acquired was a version of the language that was grammatically careful and contextually limited. He knew how to ask for things and how to express gratitude and how to apologize and how to ask where something was. He did not know how to understand the answer at speed. This produced in the early days of the trip a pattern. He asked something, received an answer in fluent native speech that arrived too fast for him to parse, and stood in the small frozen moment of a person who understood he was being answered but could not decode the answer. He developed strategies. He learned to say, in the language, "Could you repeat that more slowly?" He learned to confirm what he thought he had understood. He learned the particular combination of attentiveness and humility that talking in another language required, the attentiveness to catch every possible word, the humility to acknowledge when he had missed them. Something unexpected happened in the 3rd week. His brain, which had been scrambling for the words, began to find them faster. Not fluently, not smoothly, but faster. The gap between hearing and understanding began to close, not to nothing, but meaningfully. He began to catch sentences in their entirety. He began to respond without translating first. This was one of the stranger experiences of the trip. He was the same person, with the same brain, in which something had reorganized itself without his awareness or assistance. The language had been loading slowly, and then, one day in the third week, it was more there than it had been. He came home with a competence he had not left with. He continued to study. The 8 months before the trip had given him the scaffold. The trip had given him something inside the scaffold. Both were necessary. Neither alone would have been enough. He thought about this when people asked him the best way to learn a language. He gave the honest answer: study enough to survive, then go, and let the place teach you what the study couldn't. Story 9. Traveling together. The first trip they took together as a couple was, in retrospect, an excellent test that they had not intended as a test. They had been together for 8 months. They knew each other well enough to be comfortable and not yet well enough to have been genuinely tested. A week in a foreign city, sharing a small hotel room, navigating a country where neither of them spoke the language, with a map and 2 different ideas about the right pace for a holiday. This was, they would agree later, a test. She liked to move quickly through cities, covering ground, seeing things, making the most of the days. He liked to stay in one place until he understood it, to have coffee in the same place twice, to return to things. These styles were not incompatible but required negotiation, and the negotiation of how to travel turned out to be a proxy for a number of other negotiations they had not yet had. On the third day, they had a disagreement that was ostensibly about whether to visit a museum that afternoon. The disagreement was about something else, about feeling unheard, about expectations not being stated and therefore not being met. It was one of those arguments that is about what it is about and also about something larger, and both things needed to be addressed to resolve it. They walked to the museum and addressed them. This took the first hour of the museum visit and meant they saw the museum in a slightly post-argument state, which was not ideal but which had a particular transparency to it. They were both quieter and more honest and more attentive to the other person than they usually were. They had a better second half of the trip than the first. What they learned from it was not that they shouldn't travel together. They traveled together many times after, and well. What they learned was how they traveled together, which was different from how either of them traveled alone, and required its own rules and its own vocabulary. They learned to say, "I need to sit here for a while." They learned to say, "I'd like to keep moving." They learned to hear those things as information rather than imposition. The museum, when they finally looked at it, was very good. Story 10. Return. She had lived in the city for 3 years in her late 20s, and going back, 8 years later, was the strangest kind of travel. The city was the same city. The streets were the same streets, and yet she walked through it in the continuous double exposure of then and now, the past version of the city overlaid on the present one, the self she had been here walking alongside the self she currently was. The cafe she had gone to most mornings was still there, which surprised her. She had expected it to have become something else. She went in and sat at a table and ordered what she always used to order, and the coffee was exactly the same, and this was, for reasons she could not entirely account for, extremely moving. She walked past the flat she had lived in. Someone had put a plant on the windowsill that she had not had there, otherwise it looked the same. She stood on the pavement for a while and thought about the years she had spent at that window, the things she had watched from it, the state she had been in on various mornings, the person she had been becoming in that room without quite knowing it. She found the people she had known there scattered across different cities and different countries. Some she had stayed in touch with, some she had not. She met the ones who were still in the city for dinner, and the dinner had the quality of meetings after long gaps, the catching up, the adjustment for how people had changed, the searching for the thread. What she found, coming back, was that the city had held a version of her that she had not fully known was there, a version that had been formed by these streets and these years, and that was still partly alive in her, accessible now through return. The version was younger and less certain, and in some ways less herself, and in other ways more directly herself than she usually was. She stayed 4 days and then went home. She thought, on the plane, about the places that hold versions of us. How many we accumulate, the city of early adulthood, the town of childhood, the place of the good trip, the place of the difficult one. We are distributed across our geography in a way we don't always account for. Going back is a way of collecting some of yourself, of going to where a piece of you was left and finding, usually with some surprise, that it is still there. Story 11. The delay. The flight was delayed by 7 hours. He found this out standing in the queue for check-in, from the screen behind the desk, and took a moment to absorb it. 7 hours. He was at the airport. He had nothing with him except carry-on luggage and a book he had already nearly finished. He had a 7-hour gap to fill. He bought a coffee. He finished his book. He sat for a while in the particular nowhere of an airport terminal, the suspended quality of it, the way time in airports operated differently from time elsewhere, with a consistency of temperature and light and noise that removed the cues the body used to locate itself. He began, without any strong intention, to talk to the woman sitting next to him at the gate. She was going to the same destination for a conference. She was a marine biologist. She had opinions about airports that were different from his. She liked them, she said, for the same reason he found them strange. The suspension, the nowhere. She found it clarifying. He asked her what she was presenting at the conference. She told him something about migration patterns in a species he had not heard of, something about depth and temperature and route. He asked questions because he was genuinely interested, or became genuinely interested in the asking, which was how conversations worked at their best. She explained things. He understood some of them and did not understand others, and asked about the ones he didn't. 2 hours passed. They ate lunch at a terminal restaurant that was not very good, and talked about other things, cities they had been to, the specific qualities of different airports, whether the suspended time of a long delay was wasted or just different. She had a theory that all travel time was valuable precisely because it was neither here nor there. It was time outside the normal account, time you couldn't be productive in, and this enforced idleness was the most honest rest most busy people ever got. He thought about this on the plane, when they finally boarded. He thought she was probably right. He thought about the 7 hours, the finished book, the conversation, the bad lunch, the theory about airports. He thought they had been, in their enforced way, exactly what she had described: honest rest. The delay had given him something, not the something he had planned to do with those 7 hours. Something different and, he thought, possibly better. Story 12. What she brought back. She had been away for 3 months, and she was not sure what she was bringing back. Clothes, obviously. Some things she had bought. A few objects, a few books, a set of postcards she had sent to nobody and kept for herself. The practical inventory of a long trip. But the other inventory, the things she was bringing back in herself, was harder to take account of. She was trying to do it on the plane home, in the last few hours over the ocean. She was bringing back the understanding that she had been more capable than she had thought, This had been the central revelation of the trip. Not any specific adventure, but the accumulated evidence of 3 months of managing situations in unfamiliar places, of being lost and finding her way, of getting things wrong and recovering, of the competence that builds quietly when it is required daily. She had left not quite sure she could do it. She was returning knowing she could. She was bringing back a revised idea of what she needed. She had packed heavily and carried the pack for 3 months, and by the end understood that she had needed perhaps a third of what she had brought. This seemed to be a metaphor for something, though she was suspicious of travel metaphors. She thought it might simply be information, literal information about what she actually used versus what she had believed she might need. She was bringing back some people. Not literally. They were in their own countries, their own lives. But they were in her now, the conversations and the connections. The woman on the overnight bus who had shared food without being asked. The man at the hostel who had been traveling alone for a year and who was quiet in a way that was not sad but contained. The 2 friends she had made in the 3rd week who had been with her for 10 days and then gone their own way, and whose messages were already in her phone. And she was bringing back the question, which she had been carrying for the last 2 weeks without an answer, and was not sure she needed an answer for yet. What now? Not in the panic sense, not in the sense of the plan that needed to be made, in the open sense. The sense of a person who has expanded slightly and is curious about what the expanded version is going to do. The plane began its descent. The lights of the city she had come from appeared below her, the familiar geography of home, looking from up here like a diagram of itself. She pressed her forehead to the window. She was going back. She was also, in every way that mattered, going forward. The trip had done what trips did when they were good. It had given her back to herself, slightly larger, slightly more awake, slightly more sure of the things she was less sure of, and less sure of the things she had been most certain about. This was, she thought, enough. More than enough. Everything a journey owed you. Story 8. The Wrong Train. He had taken the wrong train and had arrived somewhere he had not intended to be, and it had been one of the better days of the trip. The intended destination had been the city. The wrong train had taken him to a small town on the coast that he had not heard of. He had realized the mistake when the train had stopped, and the announced destination was not his destination, and he had had a moment of mild alarm, followed by the reasonable question, "What is here?" What was there was a harbor, a handful of restaurants along the waterfront, a fishing boat coming in with the morning catch, and the particular quality of light that coastal towns had in the morning. He had walked around the town for 3 hours. He had eaten at one of the restaurants. He had sat at the harbor and watched the boat unloading. He had caught the correct train in the afternoon, which had arrived in the city in time for the evening. He had thought about the day since then, not as a lesson in something exactly, as a reminder that some of the best things were not chosen but encountered. That planning determined the framework and the encounters happened inside the framework without reference to the plan. The wrong train had been, from the point of view of the day, the right train. Story 9. The Host Family. She had stayed with a host family for 3 weeks in her early 20s, in a country where she did not speak the language well, and the 3 weeks had been disorienting and formative in equal measure. The family had been patient with her language and her habits, which were clearly different from their own, and she had tried to be patient with the things that were unfamiliar. The bathroom arrangements were different. The mealtimes were different. The rhythm of the household was different in ways she could not have anticipated. By the 2nd week, she had found her place in the household's rhythm. She had learned where things were. She had learned a few phrases that were specific to the household. She had begun to understand more of what was being said around her, even if she could not contribute much. She had left at the end of the third week with the distinct feeling of having been inside a life rather than beside it. Not her life, their life, specific and particular, and not transferable. But the being inside was what travel of that kind offered, and what tourism never quite reached. She thought about the family often. She hoped, when she thought about them, that she had been a reasonably easy guest. She suspected she had been a more difficult one than she had appeared to be. Story 10. The language. She had spent a year learning a language before going to the country where it was spoken, and when she arrived, she had found that the year of learning was and was not preparation. It was preparation in the sense that she could navigate the basics, buy things, ask directions, understand enough to manage. This was more than nothing. The year had given her the scaffolding. What the year had not prepared her for was the speed, the regional accent, the casual contractions, the way people actually talked rather than the way they talked in her textbook. The spoken language arrived faster and less completely than she had expected, and she had had to make peace, in the first weeks, with understanding less than she had hoped. She had made the peace. She had continued to study, in the country now, which was the most effective study of all. She had found that the year of preparation had made the in-country learning faster, because the scaffolding was there to hang new things on. By the end of the year in the country, she spoke the language in a way she could not have predicted from the textbook year. It was in her body as well as her head. It came out differently, quicker, less hesitant, with the particular music of the spoken version. She had not stopped learning it since. Story 11. The Travel Companion. She had traveled alone for years before traveling with someone else, and she had found both kinds necessary and different. The solo travel was hers completely. The pace was hers. The decisions were hers. She had found, in solo travel, things about herself that only solitude revealed. Preferences she had not known she had. Capabilities she had not tested. The quality of her own company, which had turned out to be reasonably good. The travel with her companion was different in every respect. The pace was negotiated. The decisions were shared. There were moments when what she wanted and what he wanted were not the same, and the navigation of these moments was its own form of information about the relationship. She had found that travel was unusually revealing in this respect. The ordinary softening of incompatibilities that daily life provided, routine, separate time, the buffer of familiar context, was not available in travel. You were together, in unfamiliar circumstances, managing with whatever you actually had. She had found out things about her companion in travel that years of ordinary life together had not shown her. She had found out good things, mostly. This was, she thought, what you hoped for. Story 12. The Map. She had a collection of maps from places she had been, and she used them in a specific way. She read them before she arrived. Not to plan every step, she disliked over-planned travel, but to understand the geography before she was in it, where the hills were, where the water was, how the streets arranged themselves, whether the city was a grid or an organic tangle. The map gave her a structure she could then depart from. She had found that arriving in a place with the geography already approximately understood meant she could orient herself faster and spend less time disoriented and more time present. The disorientation of not knowing where things were was a real cost of travel, and the map reduced it. She also read the maps after she had left, to see the places she had been in their proper relation. Sometimes she had been somewhere without knowing, from the map where it was in relation to other things. The post-trip map reading made the geography coherent in a way the trip itself sometimes had not. She thought the map was one of the most underrated tools of travel, not to plan rigidly but to understand the shape of the place. Story 13. The Slow Journey. He had taken a slow journey by train across a continent that most people flew across in 2 hours, and the slowness had been the point. The flight would have delivered him to the destination. The train had delivered him through the landscape, which was a different thing. He had watched the landscape change over 2 days from the window of the train, the flat northern country becoming hilly, the hills becoming mountains, the mountains descending to a different kind of plain. He had watched light move across fields and cities and rivers for hours. He had slept on the train, the movement working the way movement did for sleep, and had woken to different country. He had eaten in the dining car with strangers and had talked to some of them in the way of people sharing a long journey. He had spent hours with nothing to do but look out of the window, which was not nothing. He had arrived at the destination knowing the shape of the journey, having a physical sense of the distance he had traveled and the land it crossed. The flight would not have given him this. The train had given him the journey as its own experience, not simply as the cost of reaching the destination. He planned a slow journey every few years. He did not regret the time they took. Story 14. The Unexpected Weather. She had planned to spend a week hiking, and it had rained for 4 of the 7 days, and she had hiked in the rain and it had been fine. She had not expected it to be fine. She had planned for good weather and had packed accordingly, and had had to buy additional waterproof things in the first town she could reach. She had set out each morning regardless. The hiking in rain had been different from the hiking she had planned. The paths were muddier. The visibility was sometimes limited. She arrived at the ends of days wet in a way that good weather would not have produced. She was fine. She dried out each evening and went out the next morning. The landscapes in rain had been extraordinary in the specific way that rain light on hills was extraordinary. She had seen things she would not have seen in the clear weather she had planned for. The cloud effects, the way the mountains appeared and disappeared in the mist, the quality of the light when the rain briefly lifted. She had arrived home thinking, "I hiked in the rain for 4 days and it was one of the best trips I have taken." This was not what she had planned. It was what had happened. She had decided to find it good, and it had been good, which was not always how the decision went, but had gone that way this time. Story 15. The Return. Coming home from a long trip was always, she had found, its own experience distinct from the trip itself. She was always glad to be home, and always slightly strange in the home for the first few days. The familiar had the quality of the slightly unfamiliar, not because it had changed, but because she had changed enough to see it freshly. The things she had had all along looked different for having been away from them. Some of them looked better. Some of them she wondered about. She had found that the strangeness of return was useful if she paid attention to it. It was the moment when she could see her life from slightly outside it, the habits and arrangements and choices that were normally invisible because they were simply how things were. The trip had given her a temporary outside. She tried to use it before the strangeness faded and things became ordinary again, which they always did within a week. She did not travel primarily for this reason. There were other, better reasons. But the return perspective was one of the genuine gifts of travel that she had found herself depending on more as the years went on. Story 16. The Place That Changed Her. There was a place she had visited at 23 that had changed her in a way she still could not entirely account for. She had not been prepared for it. She had arrived as a tourist, with the usual orientation, and had found something she had not been looking for. A quality of beauty that was not aesthetic exactly, but experiential. The landscape had done something to her that she could not name. She had been there, and it had been different, and she had left different from the person who had arrived. She had gone back once, a decade later, wondering whether it would have the same effect. It had been beautiful. It had not done the same thing. The same thing, she had come to understand, was specific to the first encounter. The place had been a meeting point between the landscape and who she had been at 23, and the 23-year-old had changed, and the meeting could not be repeated. She held the first visit carefully. It was one of the experiences she returned to when she thought about what had shaped her. Not an event exactly. Nothing had happened, no one had said anything. Just a place and a person, and the fact of their encounter, which had produced something she carried still. Story 17. The Overnight Bus. She had taken an overnight bus on a budget journey when she was in her 20s, and had arrived at the destination exhausted, and had immediately known it was worth it. The bus had left at midnight and had wound through mountains in the dark, and she had sat awake for most of it, watching the dark shapes of the mountains against the sky. The other passengers had slept, mostly. She had not been able to sleep. She had watched the dark landscape for 7 hours. She had arrived at dawn. The destination was a coastal town, and she had walked from the bus station to the beach and had sat on the beach as the light came up, and the colors had been the colors of early morning beside the sea, and she had been very tired and very awake and very glad. She thought about the overnight bus. When she thought about what budget travel had given her, that well-funded travel had not always given her. The discomfort had put her in places at times when she would not otherwise have been. The beach at dawn, the mountain in the dark. The discomfort and the arrival were not separable. The arrival was the arrival. It was because of what had preceded it. Story 18. The Museum. She had spent an entire day in one museum. Not the whole museum, which would have required a week, but one section of one museum, and it had been one of the best days of the trip. She had resisted this at first. The city offered many things, and spending an entire day inside seemed like a choice that required justification. She had made no justification. She had simply walked into the museum in the morning and had stayed until it closed. The section was one she had not intended to spend the day in. She had walked in with a vague plan to see several things and had found something in the first room that she could not leave. She had spent an hour with the same piece. She had come back to it twice more in the day. She had sat in front of it and looked until looking became something more like understanding. She thought about the museum day when she thought about the difference between tourist and traveler, a distinction she was not usually interested in making but which this day had clarified. The tourist had a list of things to see and moved through the list. The traveler found something and stayed. She had stayed. She was glad. Story 19. The Locals. She had made a friend in a city she visited regularly for work, and having the friend had changed the city entirely. Before the friend, the city was hotels and meetings and the 3 restaurants she had found that were good. After the friend, the city was the neighborhood where the friend lived, the market they went to, the bar where the friend knew the owner, the parks that were not in any guidebook because they were ordinary parks that people used rather than destinations. She thought about this when people asked how to find the real version of a city rather than the tourist version. The answer was, find someone who lives there, not to be taken on a tour, to be included in their ordinary life, briefly. enough to see what the ordinary life contained. She did not always have this option. She had found it when it was available to be the best kind of travel there was. Not the dramatic version, no landmarks, no bucket list items. The ordinary version. The park, the market, the bar where someone knew your friend's name. Story 20. The solo trip. She had taken a solo trip at 35, the first one since her 20s, when solo travel had been more common, and she had found it different at 35 than it had been at 25. At 25, the solo travel had been about freedom, the not having to compromise, the going exactly where she wanted, the claim of independence. It had been partly a performance of the independent self. At 35, the solo travel was quieter. She knew she was independent. She did not need to demonstrate it. The trip was for other things, the particular quality of attention that solitude produced, the time without the usual demands, the encounter with herself in conditions that were not the usual conditions. She had found, on the trip, that she was better company than she had remembered. She had also found that she missed people, specific people, not people in general, in a way that she carried back home with gratitude. The trip had clarified what she valued by removing it temporarily. Story 21. The language of the place. She had found, in the places she had traveled, that the language carried the culture in ways that translation lost. Not in the obvious sense, that translation was imperfect, which everyone knew, but in the sense that the language shaped the way things were seen. The words that existed in one language and not in another. The things that were worth naming in one place and that had no name in another. The tone and register that were available in one language and required a different register in another. She had spent time in a place whose language she did not speak, surrounded by conversations she could not understand, and had found it a strange and useful experience. She had had to read the other things, the tone, the body language, the expressions. She had had to be more attentive to everything that was not language, which was, it turned out, a great deal. She had come away more aware of what language did and did not carry. The language carried much. It did not carry everything. The rest was in the people, in the place, in the things that were available to her even when the words were not. Story 22. The photograph she didn't take. She had been somewhere beautiful and had made the decision not to photograph it, and had not regretted it once. The place was a hilltop at sunset, and the light was the kind of light that photographers were always trying to capture, and she had watched other people around her raise their phones and take pictures, and she had put her own phone in her pocket and looked. She had looked at the light on the hills and the sky and the colors at the edges of things. She had looked until the light changed, and then she had looked at the changed light. She had been fully there, which was the thing the photograph would have interrupted. She did not have a photograph of the place. She had the place in her memory with a vividness that she attributed to the looking. She had given the place her full attention, and the place had given her full attention back. She had not stopped photographing entirely. She photographed many things, but she had started to notice when she was photographing in order to be present, to prove she had been there versus actually being present. They were different activities, and only one of them was the thing she was trying to do. Story 23. The border. Crossing a border, even a simple one, always made her think. She had crossed many borders, the unmanned ones in the middle of forests, the busy ones with long queues and booths and stamps, the ones where the process was straightforward, and the ones where it had been, for reasons of her passport or her timing or her luck, more difficult. The border was the place where the world showed its constructed nature. The land on either side was the same land, the same soil, the same geology, often the same landscape. The border said, "This is one thing, and that is another thing," and the difference was real, with real consequences, even though the ground beneath did not acknowledge it. She had thought about the privilege of crossing borders easily, which she had, and about the people for whom the crossing was not easy. She had tried not to cross borders carelessly, without noticing. Each crossing was a moment when the arrangements of the world were visible. Story 24. The Long Walk. She had walked for 5 days on a long-distance route, staying in small guest houses, carrying everything she needed on her back. The first day had been about the feet, which had communicated their displeasure by the afternoon. The second day had been about settling into the pace. By the third day, something had shifted, and the walking had become the natural state, and everything else, the sitting in cars, the stopping for reasons other than the walking, was what felt strange. She had found on the walk a quality of thinking she could not replicate elsewhere. The walking, the landscape, the simple repetition of the step had produced a particular quality of mind, calm, available, working on problems that had been resistant before. She had arrived at understandings on the walk that she had not arrived at in the months of sitting at her desk thinking about them. She thought the body's movement had something to do with this. The thinking and the walking were not separate activities. The thinking happened in the moving. She had not expected to miss the walk as much as she had once it was over. She planned another for the following year. Story 25. The Festival. She had arrived in a town by accident during a festival she had not known was happening, and the accidental arrival had been one of the best things about the trip. The festival was local, not the kind that appeared in travel guides, not the kind designed for visitors. It was the kind that happened in the town square every year, and that people came to from the surrounding villages, and that had its own logic and order she did not fully understand. She had watched. She had not tried to participate, because participation in something she did not understand felt presumptuous. She had found a place to stand and had watched for 2 hours, and had understood less than half of what was happening, and had been entirely absorbed. She had later looked up what the festival was for. The context had not changed the experience significantly. The experience had been the watching, the people, the music, the particular atmosphere of a community doing something it had been doing together for a long time. She had been there. Story 26. The food that was the place. She had eaten something in a city that she had not been able to replicate anywhere else, and the not being able to replicate was part of what made the memory of it strong. The thing itself had been simple, the kind of dish that was everywhere in that city, and that she ate 3 times during the week she was there. She had assumed, returning home, that she would find it or make it. She had found versions and made versions, and none of them had been it. She had eventually understood that the dish and the place were not separable. The dish had been what it was in the context of the city, the temperature of the day she had first eaten it, the particular street she had been on, her state at that point in the trip. Take any of those away, and the dish was just food, which was fine, but was not the thing she had been trying to recreate. She thought about this when people tried to recreate experiences. Some experiences were the sum of their conditions. You could take the recipe home, but you couldn't take the afternoon. Story 27. Getting lost on purpose. He had developed the habit, in cities he visited, of getting deliberately lost. Not lost in the distressing sense. He carried his phone for genuine emergencies. lost in the sense of taking streets without knowing where they led, of following something interesting, a sound, a smell, a building that looked worth investigating, without reference to a map or a plan. The deliberately lost hours had produced more of what he valued in travel than the planned hours. The cafe he would not have found, the neighborhood he would not have visited, the accidental view of something from an unexpected angle. The planned hours were also necessary. He was not against plans. The museum he had read about was in the plan, and he was glad to have been there. But the plan was the structure, and the getting lost was what happened between the structure, and the between was often where the best things were. He had found this was true of his life in general. The plan provided the frame. The unexpected things happened in the gaps. He had learned to leave gaps. Story 28. The Hostel. She had stayed in hostels throughout her 20s and had found them, in retrospect, more formative than any hotel she had stayed in since. The hostel put you in rooms with strangers. This was the mechanism. You arrived, you were assigned a bed, and the other beds in the room were occupied by people you did not know and had not chosen. The social conditions were unusual. The enforced proximity without social connection, the shared space without shared purpose except the being there. She had had remarkable conversations in hostel common rooms. She had met people she had kept in contact with for years. She had also had terrible nights in rooms with people who snored. The two were not incomparable. Both were part of what the hostel offered, and the offer was the exposure to people she would not have encountered otherwise. She stayed in hotels now, usually. She was comfortable with this, but she thought the hostel years had given her something she was still benefiting from, a reduced fear of strangers, an ability to make conversation in unfamiliar conditions, a flexibility about sleeping arrangements that had proved useful more than once. Story 29. The Journey Home. The journey home from a long trip always had a particular quality, a mixture of tired and full and the beginning of anticipation for what was ordinary. She had been away for 3 weeks, and the ordinary was waiting for her. Her bed, her kitchen, the walk she took most mornings, the specific combination of her own things arranged in her own space. She had not been longing for these things while she was away. She had been too absorbed in being away. Now that she was heading home, the anticipation of them was present and pleasant. She thought about what this said about the nature of home. Home was the thing you didn't think about until you were going back to it. The absence was not felt while you were present in the other place. The return made the home visible again, briefly, as the specific and particular thing it was. She had found, over many trips and returns, that the most useful thing she could do with the return perspective was notice it and use it before it faded. What do I have, in my life, that I had stopped seeing because I am always in it? The trip had shown her things by removing them. The return was the moment to acknowledge them. Story 30. What travel is for. She had been asked many times why she traveled, and she had many answers, and after many years she thought the truest one was this: to practice being somewhere. Not to go somewhere. She could go places without being there. She had gone places without being there, had been present in body, while somewhere in her head running the usual internal programs. Travel that was only going was expensive and exhausting, and did not change you. Being somewhere was the practice. The full attention of the senses on the place. The willingness to be where you were, rather than planning the next thing or reviewing the previous thing. The openness to what was actually here, as opposed to what you had planned or expected. She had found this practice available at home too, once she had learned it in travel. The same quality of being somewhere that she had found in foreign cities was available on the street she walked every day, if she brought the same quality of attention to it. Travel had taught her to be where she was. Where she was everywhere. She planned to keep going. She planned to keep being there when she arrived. Story 31. The Unexpected Kindness. She had been struggling with her luggage on a station platform, and 3 different people had helped before she had a chance to ask. This was not remarkable in itself. People helped with luggage on platforms. What she had noticed was the quality of the help. No fuss, no making of a thing, just the luggage lifted and carried and set down. She had said thank you 3 times and received 3 different versions of you're welcome that were all equally unremarkable and all equally genuine. She had thought about this later, in the way she often thought about small things that had unexpectedly mattered. She had been in a country whose language she did not speak, and 3 people had helped her in the physical, wordless way, and she had felt, briefly, that the world was on her side. Travel had given her many experiences of this. The spontaneous help, the stranger who appeared at the right moment, the small kindness that was specific to being an unfamiliar person in an unfamiliar place and needing something. She had been helped. She had tried to be helpful in return, to strangers in other contexts, because the cycle seemed the right response. Story 32. The City at Night. She had always preferred to walk cities at night. The night city was different from the day city. Some things were closed that had been open, other things had opened that had been closed. The crowd was different, fewer and different people with different purposes. The light was artificial and directed, which made some things more visible and others less, which was a different kind of seeing from the even light of day. She had developed the habit of one long night walk in any city she visited for more than 2 days. Not to see things specifically, the night walk was less efficient for seeing things. To feel the city in its other register, to understand the place at a different time. She had found, in city after city, that the night walk was when she fell in love with a place or confirmed she was indifferent to it. The day city was the city with its public face. The night city was something closer to the actual character of the place, what it was when it was not performing for visitors. She trusted her judgment of night cities. Story 33. The Return Visit. She had gone back to a city she had loved at 22, at 38, and had found it different, and herself different, and the experience genuinely interesting, rather than disappointing. She had been afraid it would be disappointing. The 22-year-old version of the visit had the specific intensity of a first love, and she had known, in the abstract, that the return would not reproduce that intensity. She had gone back anyway, because she had wanted to see what was still there. What was still there was the city, the streets, the buildings, the river, the light. These were unchanged in their essentials. What was different was her relationship to them. She was not the 22-year-old who had found everything new. She was 38 and familiar with the city and with herself, and the familiarity had produced a different kind of attention. She had found things she had not found at 22. She had been in a different phase of life at 22, responsive to different things, missing other things entirely. At 38, she had seen the city through the eyes she currently had, which were different eyes, and she had found different things to love. The city had not diminished, she had changed. The change had given her access to things the previous version of her had been too young to find. She was glad she had gone back. Story 34. The Language School. He had spent 4 weeks at a language school in another country when he was in his 40s, and it had been a strange and valuable experience. He had been the oldest student by 15 years, which had not been what he expected, and which had produced a specific kind of social situation. The adult in a class of young people, learning something the young people learned more easily, which was uncomfortable and useful. He had learned the language more slowly than the younger students and had retained it better, which he attributed to having more to connect it to. He had also found, in the difficulty, a sympathy he had not previously had for people who were learning things in their non-native language. He had been struggling with a language at the level of a 12-year-old, in a country where everyone was fluent, and the struggle had been illuminating. He had made friends with two of the younger students, which had surprised him. The commonality of the learning, the shared difficulty, the shared small victories, had been enough of a basis. He had come home with more of the language than he had expected. He had also come home with something harder to name, a refreshed sense of what learning felt like from the beginning, which he had not experienced in a long time. Story 35, the last story. She had been traveling for most of her adult life and had arrived, in her 50s, at something she thought of as the settled purpose of travel. Early travel had been about the new country, the new city, the new landscape, the new experience. She had accumulated new experiences voraciously and had been satisfied with the accumulation. She had been to many places. In the middle years, the travel had become more selective. She had returned to places she loved as often as she discovered new ones. She had found depth where she had previously found breadth, and depth had given her things breadth had not. In the more recent years, she had come to understand what she was actually doing when she traveled. She was practicing attention in conditions that made attention easy. She was putting herself in places that required her to be present. She was meeting the world on terms that the daily life at home did not offer. She would keep traveling as long as she could, not because the world still held things she had not seen. It did, vastly, but she was no longer collecting, because travel was what happened when she put herself in motion in the world, and what happened when she was in motion was the best version of herself. Curious, open, attentive, willing to be surprised. She had been surprised many times. She looked forward to being surprised again. Story 36, the rain in Lisbon. She had been in Lisbon when it rained for 2 days, which she had not expected, and the rain had given the city a quality she would not have found otherwise. The rain had emptied the tourist streets. The famous viewpoints had been quiet, the light soft and gray, the city visible in its own terms rather than framed for visitors. She had walked in the rain with her jacket and her hood and had found the streets genuinely empty, which had given her the rare feeling of a city belonging to itself. She had seen a woman standing in a doorway watching the rain with an expression she could not read. She had seen a cafe full of people who were there because of the weather, rather than in spite of it, talking and drinking their coffee and not in a hurry. She had seen the tiled buildings with the rain making the colors deeper and the reflections sharp on the wet pavements. She had needed the rain to see Lisbon that way. The rain had been the condition of the seeing. Story 37, the thing about not speaking the language. He had been in a place for 3 weeks without any shared language with the people around him and had found that communication happened anyway, not easily or fully. But essentially, the things that needed to be communicated were communicated through the usual backup systems: gesture, expression, tone, demonstration, drawing, patience. He had managed to eat, to sleep, to ask for directions, to apologize when he needed to laugh when something was funny. He had found the experience of wordlessness clarifying. Without language, he was reduced to what was available without it, and what was available without it was more than he had thought. The face communicated. The body communicated. The willingness to keep trying communicated. He had come home thinking differently about language. He knew it was the primary tool, the richest and most efficient. But it was not the only tool. In its absence, the other things, the older, more fundamental things, emerged. He found this, in retrospect, one of the more interesting experiences travel had given him. Story 38, the second time around. She had revisited a trip she had taken in her 20s, following the same approximate route 30 years later, and had written about what she found. She had not written it publicly. She wrote it for herself, in a notebook she carried. She had written about the differences, the places that had changed, the prices, the infrastructure, the volume of tourists, the things that had been there and were not, and the things that had appeared since. She had also written about the thing that had not changed, which was harder to name. Some quality of the light in certain places, the way certain landscapes arranged themselves, the fundamental character of some cities that absorbed decades of change and remained recognizably themselves. And she had written about the different reader she brought to it. At 20, she had seen one thing. At 50, she saw other things, the same places disclosing different meanings to the older person she was. She had not known at 20 what to look for. At 50, she knew more, and the knowing let her see what she had missed. She thought the trip was worth taking twice. She thought most things were. Story 39. The kindness of strangers abroad. She had needed help in a foreign city and had received it, and the receiving had stayed with her. Her bag had been stolen, not a catastrophe, just the passport and the cards, which was enough to be significant. She had stood at a police station desk and had been unable to communicate fully with the officer, and a woman waiting behind her had stepped forward and had translated for 40 minutes. The woman had then walked her to the embassy. She had then bought her a coffee and had waited with her while she made the calls she needed to make. She had refused to take anything for the waiting. She had eventually, it took 2 days, been able to continue. She had thought, in the 2 difficult days, about the woman who had translated and waited and refused to take anything. She had thought about the quality of help that was simply given, without calculation, to a stranger in a foreign city who needed it. She had not been able to find the woman to thank her properly. She had left the city carrying the gift of what had been given to her, unable to return it and committed to passing it on. Story 40. The last story. She had been asked, at a dinner party, what travel had taught her that staying at home could not have, and she had thought about it seriously before answering. She had said, "It taught me that the world is larger than my habits make it appear, and that most of the largeness is good." She had meant the places, the people, the ways of doing ordinary things that were not her way and worked equally well or better. The food she had not known existed, the conversations she had had with people she would not have met, the views she would not have seen, the experiences that had no equivalent in the daily life she returned to. She had also meant something smaller. She had been places where things did not work the way they worked at home, where the systems were different and the expectations were different, and she had managed. She had been uncomfortable and she had managed. She had been lost and she had managed. She had been in situations she had not chosen and had found her way through them. The world was large and mostly good, and she was more capable in it than she had known before she had been in more of it. This was what travel had given her. She did not think home could have given it in the same way. She was grateful for every trip. She was grateful to be home. She planned to leave again. Story 41. The Small City. She had spent a week in a small city that nobody she knew had been to, and that she had chosen from a map almost at random, and it had been one of her favorite trips. The small city had no famous things in it, no landmark that appeared in travel articles. It had a market, a river, an old quarter, a handful of good places to eat, and the ordinary life of people who lived there. She had walked every street in the old quarter over the course of the week. She had eaten in the same 2 places repeatedly because they were good, and because the returning made her feel less like a visitor. She had sat by the river on multiple afternoons. She had bought things at the market that she used at home for months. She thought about the small city when people asked her about travel in terms of lists, the places you had to see, the things you had to do. She thought the small city with no famous things in it had given her something the famous places had not. The simple experience of being somewhere, without the frame of significance, without the obligation to find it worthy of having gone. She had been there. She had liked it. That was enough. Story 42. The Departure. She had found that the moment of departure, the airport, the station, the beginning of the journey, had a specific quality she did not experience at any other time. The departure was the threshold between the familiar and the unknown, and it had a quality of suspension. She was no longer in the ordinary life, but not yet in the travel. She was between the two, in the space of the journey itself. She had learned to like this space rather than treat it as the cost of arrival. She had learned to not fill the hours of transit with productivity, the emails, the calls, the things that would be waiting when she returned. She let the transit be transition, the time of arriving at the place she was going, not only physically but mentally. She arrived better for this. She arrived at the place with the ordinary life already somewhat behind her, the transition having been used as transition. She was more present at the destination for having treated the journey as the beginning of the change rather than a gap to be filled. Story 43. The Place That Was Enough. She had spent 3 days in a small village with nothing to do, and the nothing to do had been exactly what she needed. The village had a square with a cafe and a church and some trees. It had a path through the fields. It had the sounds of a small place, animals, wind, distant vehicles. She had walked the path, sat in the cafe, read her book, slept well, and eaten simply. She had not been productive. She had not been particularly stimulated. She had been rested, in a way that the usual holiday, the new city, the things to see and do, did not always produce. She thought about this on the way home. The rest had come from the absence of the demand. She had been somewhere with no expectations of what she should see or do, and in the absence of those expectations she had found what was actually there: the square, the path, the cafe, the quiet. She had not needed the village to be impressive. She had needed it to be quiet and real. It had been both. And there we leave her, forehead to the window, descending through the dark. Travel is one of the oldest stories humans tell. We go and we come back, and the going has changed us, and we carry the change home, and it becomes part of us. Every wrong train and overnight train, every mountain and guest house and 7-hour delay, every language half understood and conversation had across a terminal table, these are the things that make the traveler, not the sites visited or the photographs taken, the things that happened in between. Thank you for traveling with us tonight, through these stories, through this English. Wherever you are in the world as you listen, in a city or a village, at home or far from it. We hope something in tonight's words carried you somewhere good. Please subscribe to this channel if it helps your learning. Share us with a friend who is learning English. Leave a comment in the morning. We would love to know where in the world you are listening from. Sleep well. Dream of somewhere you have been or somewhere you will go. We will see you next time.